The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the 6th day of this Rohatsu Sesshin here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico in December 2020. And I'd like to share again with you some of the Zen master Hakuin's Rohatsu Exhortations, with thanks to Norman Waddell for translating these and allowing us to use them, and to Shannon, who retyped them in large print so that I could actually have a chance of reading them. I wanted also to say something about change, because there will be change tomorrow. As some of you know, our kitchen refrigerator has pooped out, probably the compressor or the compressor controls or both. And we haven't had a kitchen refrigerator for more than a week at this point. And tomorrow, we hope, the one repair person who is willing to come all the way up here into the mountains to service that piece of equipment is due to come. He was supposed to come yesterday, but he texted us and said that he had hurt his back, and so he would be coming tomorrow morning. There was a window between 10:30 and 11:30. So at some point during that time, he will come, hopefully discover what's going on with the refrigerator. I think he pretty much already knows, because it's unfortunately a common feature or common drawback of this particular model and this particular year and this particular style and this particular brand of refrigerator, although apparently the compressor problem is not limited to this particular refrigerator or this particular brand. At any rate, as I said, things change, and since he's coming so close to lunchtime, we eat lunch here at noon. There is a chance that our lunch may be delayed. It depends on whether he just needs a quick look-see, and then he'll go back to his office and order parts, or what will happen. So be prepared. And actually, this is the nature of life, change. And this is a cause of great deal of suffering for people. People want times and situations that they can depend upon. And essentially, there's no guarantee. It is something that happens. Plans are changed. People have other things happening that interfere with their being here, like our workman who hurt his back. And any number of things happen. People die, people get sick, people lose jobs, all kinds of things happen. And we keep trying to assume that everything is going to be exactly the way we want it to be all the time, and it can't be. So what does that leave us with? An opportunity for flexibility. An opportunity to be able to be free enough that we can shift with the current, flow with the river, and move forward, even if it's not the direction we thought we were going to be moving in, without any friction, without any problems. And of course, there are problems, but the problems don't have to be problems. And that's something that advanced Zen students have a chance to experience. And in fact, this is how we naturally can be without any extra stuff. The problem is we lose track of that ability because we are trying to fit in with society in ways that may be rather rigid, at least in our own minds. And we want security, we want consistency, we want dependability, and we're not going to get it all the time. And so the more we are able to be flexible and to move with circumstance, the freer, the more joyful, the easier our life will be. And our Zen practice brings us to that point if we're willing to persist long enough. And of course, as you've heard so many times, along the way, it's not just like we're going to open a door and walk through and be free. We're going to walk through a hall of mirrors that show us where we're caught. And as we gradually let go of those caught places, and seeing them is a big step, vital step in the process of doing so, gradually we do become free and more flexible and more able to move with circumstance. And our life changes. It's so much less stressful. So again, we're going to share Zen Master Hakuin Ekaku's Rohatsu Exhortations for the 6th night. An attendant brought a cup of tea for the master. He said, when Zen Master Yosai, founder of Kenninji, which is one of the major temples in Kyoto, and still functioning as a teaching temple, I believe, was in China, he took ill during a spell of excessive heat. An old priest cured him by giving him some tea to drink. When Yosai returned to Japan, he took tea seeds back with him for the palace in Kyoto. By the way, it was illegal to do that, but somehow he was able to smuggle them out. Some seeds were later planted in Uji, and some went to Myo-e Shonin, who planted them at his temple west of the capital. Because of this, Yosai is regarded as the father of tea in Japan. The virtue of tea lies in its mildly bitter taste, which works to strengthen the heart. When the heart is sound, the other bodily organs also function normally. Myo-e said, tea is good for driving out the demon of sleep and should be used by those practicing the way. A little comment here. Human beings need sleep to function, but in Sesshin, we dare to push the envelope, because in pushing the envelope, in daring to move past our comfort zones, to do things we're not accustomed to doing, we can realize that we can actually survive and function despite that. And it gives us courage to move in other directions in our life, to become free of any rigid structures that we have erected around ourselves to seemingly keep ourselves safe. Of course, it's a balance. And this is something that Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, learned the hard way. He was born and raised in the most affluent family in his region. He had everything he wanted to have. And of course, back then, there were no such things as video games or television sets or cell phones or anything like that. Life was considerably more simple, and what there was to have was much more minimal. Nonetheless, he had no fears of not having what he needed, what he wanted. It appears that he was a fairly developed human being to begin with, and so probably his wants were not as major as they could have been. And so he lived in the lap of luxury. And as you know, the story is that his father wanted him to be inheriting the position that he had. It's not absolutely certain exactly what it was. He's called a prince His father was called a king. That's a rather elegant title for what might not have been so high, might have been simply the head of a clan. At any rate, he was important. His father was important, and his father wanted him to continue in his footsteps. And how many human fathers these days feel the same about their children? But human beings have their own karma. And some of them are destined by the dint of their karma to follow in their parents' footsteps. Others are not. And it's important to honor that. So his father essentially kept him imprisoned. Not overtly, but in essence, he sort of limited his access to the outside world pretty severely, it apparently was. And when he was 28 years old, by this time he's married and has a kid, and they're all living in the palace, if you want to call it that, he starts getting curious about what's outside those walls. And so he sneaks out one night, and it shocks him. He sees somebody who's old, bent over, not too much hair left on his head, weak, and he'd never seen a human being like that, which is a little bit of a surprise, although not so much necessarily, because people certainly didn't live very long back then. Even a century ago, people only lived close to half as long as they do now. So it's entirely possible that he really actually had never seen somebody who was that old in his life before. And it shocked him. And he was told that that's what happens with everyone if they live long enough. And so he went out on another night, the next night. And this time he saw someone who was sick. It reminds me of when I was in Hong Kong, one of the times I was passing through Hong Kong, and rounded a corner in Kowloon, and there was an elderly woman squatting in the middle of the street throwing up. You see this kind of thing in Asia and in Southeast Asia. It's not so hidden as it is in the United States or in Europe. And the Buddha, to be, was shocked by that too. He'd never been sick. He didn't know anyone who had been sick. And it didn't look like a very pleasant experience. And he was told again, this could happen to you as well. It happens to many people, maybe even most people. And then he went out the next night. This time, he saw the big one, the corpse, a dead person. At 28, somehow he had managed not to have anyone in his environment die. But here there was a corpse right in the middle of the street, as one can see in India, as we did see in 1996 when Suzui and I were traveling in India. We were actually we had gone to a conference of Western ordained Buddhist women, and we were on our way back to Gaya to catch a train back to Delhi to go back to Japan, actually to go to Singapore first because we were going to take a little bit of a break. India was intense for many reasons. Death was everywhere, actually. We were delayed arriving in Bodh Gaya because of transportation complications, which are quite common in places like that. And it kept us from being potential victims because 2 Westerners were murdered in that small town of Bodh Gaya the night before. And then one of the women who was coming to this gathering was in Delhi riding in a rickshaw, and it was hit by a large truck. and she was mortally injured, a lot of head injuries, and she still lived another 2 weeks, but then she died. And various people who knew her, who were at the conference, took turns going back to help take care of her in the hospital. In hospitals in countries like India and Myanmar, the family goes and takes care of the patient in the hospital, brings food, and generally is there 24/7. So then after that, I got the news that my father had died. We were sort of expecting that because I got a fax saying from my brother saying that he had stopped eating and was becoming less responsive, which was a certain indication that he was on his way out. And then on our taxi ride from Bodh Gaya to Gaya, we indeed saw a corpse lying in the road. So in the Buddha's day, when he was a kid and then a young man, he had never seen such a thing. And that really, really flummoxed him because he was told that is the end for everyone, regardless. And so he went out one more night, and this time he saw a deeply spiritual human being. And he realized through that perhaps there is a way beyond all this. It's not avoidance, but there's a way to receive it in a way that it is not traumatic. And so he went the opposite direction. In those days, the traditional way of doing spiritual practice was ascetic practice, depriving yourself of food. One of my Dharma brothers on pilgrimage through India saw a person who had been for something like 12 years bent over with his head in a hole. After 12 years, I'm not sure he would be able to stand up. But at any rate, various different ways of mortifying the body, which really comes to no positive end. And the Buddha began to realize that when he finally comprehended that trying to survive on 1 grain of rice a day, which is what it was said he was doing, was not going to sustain his body for that much longer. And if he really wanted to get an answer to these questions of why, then he better take some nourishment and try the only other route possible, which he termed the middle way. And that, for him, meant going inward. And that is why we do these seshins, to go into ourselves and search in that place within that is beyond words and that is the source of answers to our question. No matter where our question is, really. Even Einstein found the answers to his perplexity and came up with the theory of relativity through something like Zazen. He simply sat quietly, allowing his mind to sink deep without words, and bubbled up the answer. And if we persist long enough, that will happen for us as well, not necessarily the theory of relativity, but an understanding, deep, profound understanding of who we are and how to move forward and how to live an enlightened life. And that is the model for our Rohatsu Sesshin, because it was said that he sat for 7 nights and 8 days, 24/7 basically, or 24/8 maybe, and came to profound realization. As the stories tell us, he had been working on this for lifetimes before that. I suspect that each one of us has as well. And we can have an awakening experience. And of course, that is only a beginning. And it's important to recognize that. We have an awakening, it begins to show us where we need to work. And we continue working. And another awakening comes, more insights. Hakuin said that he had 19 major Kensho experiences and countless minor ones. That is our model. We don't, as Roshi Kapleau once said, and later realized that it was a good thing he didn't go for that. He wanted to go to Japan, get Kensho and run. Back then, Kensho had such a hype. And it is freeing, but we have to work within that freedom to expand and deepen it and to activate it in our daily lives. Otherwise, it's essentially worthless. It's a nice, exciting experience, but we sit, we go within, and we search. And the search is one that is blind, basically. And I think here of Hakuin's painting of 3 blind men trying to cross a bridge, and they're all kind of feeling their way along the bridge, trying not to fall in the water. And we are doing that same thing as well for a long time. Eventually we really get a hang of how to practice. But it's always still going beyond, going beyond, going beyond. So as far as sleep goes, green tea can make a big difference. It can be very helpful. It's not quite the same as coffee. It's much more smooth and easy than coffee is. Coffee can take you up to a height and drop you off a cliff. But tea is a much more gradual enlivening experience, and it doesn't drop you. You just gently come back down after quite a long time, which is why whisked green tea is highly popular and quite common, universal really, in Buddhist monasteries in Japan. We have the options to do it here too. If anybody wants to whisk themselves a bowl of green tea, we have the bowls, we have the whisks, we have all the equipment, including the tea. So just let me know, and I'll offer it to you and show you how to do it if you haven't learned already. To continue with Hakuin, except that I started to say that this thing about the demon's sleep, I wouldn't call it a demon. We need sleep, but we can go beyond, certainly for short periods of time, to great benefit. Because when we push the envelope, when we go beyond our perceived boundaries, amazing things can happen, positive ways. Sure, we can get sleepy, but then the sleepiness eases and we become awake. Many, many times every single Sesshin actually in Rochester, I pulled an all-nighter at least once during every Sesshin, and I did considerable yaza the rest of the nights. And I remember a Rohatsu Sesshin sitting all night in the zendo, deeply quiet, low lights, because I could control the lights because I was probably just about the only person there. And when I started getting sleepy, I would get up and I would walk outside in the garden. The path was shoveled from the snow, and it was quite brisk and cold, and it would wake me up. And I'd walk around and get awake again and go back and sit some more. It was incredible. It was a gift. I wouldn't call it a demon. So When it comes to strengthening the heart, however, nothing can compare to strenuous spiritual practice. If you devote yourself to your practice single-mindedly until your arduous effort becomes one with your very being, the divine energy that is within you will shine forth bright and clear. And that is really interesting. I remember not being in a particular sesshin, because you were not allowed to go to every single sesshin in Rochester. There were simply too many people to go. You could go to 2 out of 3 in every season. Although one time I was able to go to 3. But it meant that you could get at least 4 full-time 7-day seshins with Mitra-roshi, plus innumerable 4-day seshins in the Rochester system. At Sogenji, it was considerably more strict and more stringent. Every single month we had at least one 7-day sesshin, and also 5 to 7 day, 2 5 to 7 day, what they call kozeshin, which were almost as intensive as regular sesshin, and everyone was required to go to sanzen twice a day, except for the 2 or 3 days in any given month that were not in sesshin. It was tremendous. It was an incredible gift to do that intensiveness of practice. So when it comes to strengthening the heart, however, nothing can compare to strenuous spiritual practice. If you devote yourself to your practice single-mindedly until your arduous effort becomes one with your very being, the divine energy that is within you will shine forth bright and clear, and people coming out of Sesshin shine. As Zen Master Jimyo said, the arduous effort expended by the ancients possessed a radiance that cannot help but spread and grow. Jimyo was a Chinese monk who was so determined to come to awakening that he is famous because he would hold an awl at his thigh. And as he started to fall asleep, he'd slam it into his thigh and wake himself up so that he could continue to dive deeper even when he was asleep. And I should say when he was sleeping, when he was sleepy, because it would wake him up. There's another way to go about it, and that is, and I do advise pushing the envelope, but I also advise getting sleep when you need it. So when you are at a point where it feels right within you to go to bed, then you go up and you go to bed, and you do your Sosokan until you gradually drift off to sleep. In that way, that practice continues even while you're sleeping. You're not necessarily extending the out-breath, but extending the out-breath as a part of the process of entering sleep brings you to a place where you're free of thoughts and focused. And it makes a difference. We don't have to hold an awl to our thigh and stab ourselves every time we start to fall asleep. When you're really falling asleep, and there's a sense that it's not a temporary situation where you just hang in there, nod off here and there, and then you'll be bright and awake again, but you really do need that sleep, then go to bed. It's important. Just as the Buddha recognized that being extreme with his ascetic practice was not going to get him enlightenment. He had to find a middle way. And there is a middle way between sleep and not sleep. Push it, but there's a limit to how extreme you're going to want to be. Spurring students through the barrier says, when you are able to control your mind at all times, your goal of realization is as good as achieved. There's a story about that book, Spurring Students Through the Barriers, and it happens to do with Jimyo as well. As you know, Hakuin got quite discouraged in his practice when he heard that Ganto, who was quite a realized ancient Chinese master, quite famous, had died young and died by being murdered, actually. And when he was murdered, he screamed so loud that it could be heard 9 miles away. And that shook young Hakuin to the bones, because he had become a monk with the idea that if he became a monk, he could escape hell. And he was projecting on this Ganto that he was in hell when he was screaming. It may not have been that. It may simply have been his response. He may have been so one with being run through by the sword that it just erupted. He was fully present in his death, but Hakuin didn't understand that yet. And so he abandoned his practice and apprenticed himself to a calligrapher for a while. I think it was about 8 months, and realized pretty early on that he was never going to be a master calligrapher, which was ironic because he was a prolific calligrapher throughout his life, and has amazing body of artwork, paintings and calligraphy still extant all over the world, actually. And so then he started wondering what the heck. He'd become a monk to escape hell. Something was drawing him back to the monastery. So he happened in a monastery at a time when they were airing the scrolls, which they do every year because it's so damp in Japan that the scrolls get moldy, and they also get filled with bugs that tend to eat them, the silverfish. And so they were airing the scrolls, and so he thought, all right, I'm just going to go take one last stab at it. And he walked up to one of the scrolls that was being aired, closed his eyes, put his finger down, and then opened his eyes and read the passage. And it was the passage exactly about Jimyo, who was so determined to come to awakening despite all odds that he held that all to his leg and stabbed himself. And by the way, he did eventually come to a deep awakening, and he was known as a master. And so that took Hakuin back to Zen practice, thankfully for us. So, spurring students through the barrier says, when you are able to control your mind at all times, and that doesn't mean making your mind rigid. That means letting go distractions, letting go avoidance, letting go dissociation, letting go greed, anger, and ignorance, basically. Then it's very different. You should all deem the arduous effort you put forth in your practice as something of priceless worth. We get so frustrated. It seems like we're going nowhere. But actually, we are. And that is why faith is so vital in Zen practice. Because, as I've said so many times, we're flying blind. We're groping in the dark. As Roshi Kepler once said to me when I was at a point of discouragement, he said, you can be in this dark, unfamiliar room, pitch black, dark, unfamiliar room, bumping into the furniture and so on, and groping around on the walls for the light switch. At any given moment, your hand could be half an inch from the switch. So don't assume anything. Just keep going. There was a priest named Bummei from the northern provinces who wanted to come to Shoin-ji, which is Hakuin's temple. He tried in various ways for over 6 years to gain permission to study here. I told him, to me, it doesn't matter how great and celebrated a priest is. He could have the purple robe given by the emperor for all I care. If his Dharma eye remains unopened, as far as I'm concerned, he's still a novice. He needs a heavy dose of scolding and reviling. Anyone who harbors so much of a thought for the world or the slightest feeling of self-importance couldn't derive any benefit from visiting me. This says something about the dynamism of Hakuin as well as the Japanese culture. Here we do not use beatings, we do not use reviling, we do not use calling names. There's no point. It's a negative experience for Westerners. In Japan, it tends to be something more inspiring, if you could call it that. People who are called negatively often use it as a motivation to become more careful and more precise and more accomplished. But in the West, we don't go with that. And so we don't use it. Encouragement is where we work here. So you'll have to take some of these words of Hakuin with a grain of salt, understanding that it is a combination of his personality and the culture of the times and the Japanese culture, even now. There's an exceedingly strong impulse to strive in Japanese culture, to overcome, to best, to go beyond. And a certain amount of that is fine, but they have lost the sense of the middle way. In fact, it's to the point where there's a condition in which middle-aged executives spontaneously die of overwork. It's common enough that there is actually a name for it in Japan. I don't remember what the name is. I used to know it, but they simply die of overwork. The workday in Japan is exceedingly long for business people. And then after that, there's mandatory entertaining for the work, taking out clients, and so on and so forth. So there is that striving that up to a point can have some benefits, but not past a certain point. Here, what's more important than striving is sinking deep within. Not knowing, but open to possibility. That's how you come to awakening, and that is how you see where you're caught as part of that, which helps with the coming to awakening and helps to free you along that path. So there's just a little bit more here. Bummei wouldn't give up. I'm no different from a novice, he said, someone newly arrived in training, in the training hall, intent on solely achieving the great Dharma. Please, Master Hakuin, don't begrudge me your compassion. Give me the benefit of your teaching. Let me encounter your thundering shouts. Feel the stinging blows rain from your staff. I am prepared to lay down my life in pursuit of the way. I allowed Bummei to come. He spent one summer, 3 months of arduous practice in the training hall, where he was tempered and refined under countless blows from my staff. Finally, he broke through. he suddenly realized the great uplifting matter of our school. He vowed when he left that he would remain my student forever, a spirit of single-minded commitment and iron-willed reserve cannot rest until it reaches the final, ultimate attainment of the Buddha Dharma. So Bomei was already head of a temple, but he had not had an awakening experience, and he was determined to have one. And the only time he could spare was those 3 months. Then he had to go back and resume his responsibilities. But he gave himself completely to that practice during that time, and it made a difference. Just like, I think his name was Heijiro, the wealthy man who sponsored the sculpture of Fudomyo in Hakuin's time, and suddenly realized how short life was. And it couldn't stay at the party anymore because it just gripped him deeply. Went home and sat, determined to understand. And 3 days later, he had the beginning of a kensho and didn't know quite what was going on for him. And so he asked a local priest who said, sorry, I don't know, but if you go see Hakuin, he probably knows. And so he went over the mountain to Hakuin's temple. And at the top, when he could gaze out to the sea, because it was right along the inland sea, he had a kensho. And it was deep enough that he was able to pass several koans when he finally did meet up with Hakuin a few hours later and remained Hakuin's student. It gives the impression that you have to strive to do this, but a gentle striving is what's called for if we're to truly become free and not substitute striving for a different way of being imprisoned. The practice offers everything you need. You have to have faith to continue it, because otherwise there's no indication that you're going anywhere. But I can guarantee you that if you continue trying, you will eventually become free. It's just that you won't really have any signposts along the way for a long time. So have faith and keep going. And here we are, nearing the end of the 6th day of this Sesshin. Tomorrow is the final push, and I pray that everyone will take it truly deep. How deep? There's an immense depth that we can reach. And even going a little way in makes a difference. So thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.